Believe it or not, Mitchell's vs. Machines is now over 3 years old, initially releasing back on April 22nd, 2021. And so, as part of this fresh-faced anniversary series of ours, I'd like to have a look at the movie itself and see how it's influenced animation since then. As I would probably say, this is one of the best movies of the decade. A real contender for my top 50 movies of all time. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully construct a list like that, but this movie was mad good. Produced with the same studio and creative team involved, it's typically seen as the movie that proved Spider-Verse wasn't a fluke, and you could make movies that took on more dynamic animation styles. And the fact that this came out in the middle of lockdown's honestly a miracle. However, is there more to this project than just the second one after Spider-Verse? From Sony? God love A Bug's Life, but, its legacy for Pixar is often just the second one after Toy Story, and does not necessarily meet the same heights of the golden era that followed it. I don't know if anyone's ever made a comparison between A Bug's Life and Mitchell's vs. Machines before, and that probably makes sense because I would argue they have not fallen down the same pitfall from the 90s. At all. But it's worth remembering because we had no idea that at the time, a lot of the odds were very much against this movie. Going back to 2015, after finishing up his acclaimed Disney XD series Gravity Falls, Mike Rianda was tasked to pitch a new project for Sony Animation. When developing the original idea, I was surprised to hear that he started with the concept of literally just combining his personal family experience with his childhood love of robots. Suddenly it kind of makes sense that in the credits it showcases a whole chunk of the cast and crews and their actual families. And of course, the family part's obviously the most important factor, and very much why the movie is as good as it is. You can just tell by the finished product that there is so much truth and authenticity to the central family relationship, and it's done in a way that, doesn't really talk down to anyone or any generation. The part that surprises me, though, is the fact that the whole tech apocalypse plot kind of started as, I like robots, but I guess you gotta start somewhere. And it just goes to show that great ideas don't just pop up, they develop over time. And the very fact that they even were platformed to be able to tell an original story is, obviously done before with the likes of Gravity Falls for them, but also is very much a fading thing in the modern day. And it's only been 3 years. Now, during the early day productions of this project, the movie's original working title was Control-Alt-Escape, which certainly wouldn't be the last example of a dramatic title change, but also it kind of works really well. Cut to 2018 and we get to the point where Phil Lord and Christopher Miller come onto the project as producers. This would be their 4th collaboration with Sony Animation, following the Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs movies and Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, of course, as well as the 6th Sony collaboration overall when you factor in the Jump Street movies. At a festival in 2019, it was revealed by a Sony representative that the animation style being adjacent to Spider-Verse was a conscious choice, and in a very Spider-Verse manner, the robots and Mitchell family would be from different universes that would then collide. And finding this from the research, this is really interesting, as this is a concept that isn't just absent from the finished movie, it's miles away from what we eventually got. It does make me wonder at what point the plot switched from this alternative dimension plotline. Unless it was a poorly worded piece of press that they just meant the animation styles are a little different between organic and inorganic. As obviously later on they would then go into the tech company gone mad angle. And considering that was kind of the main point, and it makes you wonder, was there a point when the two were connected? Was there a point where Pow was going to open a portal to the robots rather than dispatching the robots herself? No idea. I feel this more came from Sony executives going, put as many Spider-Verse things in the movie as possible, which I'm very glad they didn't do. This movie manages to be both exorbitantly bombastic in a way that is akin to the Spider-Verse movies, while so clearly being its own thing with its own creative direction. Really, that's the best of both worlds. And to be fair, you do have Mr. Gravity Falls involved, which also played with some interdimensional stuff, so it could very well have been his idea. Whatever the case, we instead got the tech company exploiting AI to the world's detriment, which becomes scarily more topical by the year. And as much as my voice can be replaced by AI, and I have once plugged myself into a song to hear how it would sound, I feel like the more communal vibes we have here, and the actual fact that I have a personality, means I can hopefully squeak by against the AI uprising in later years. We'll see. Also, some of the self-aware commentary beats about exploitative tech companies is wild when you consider that this was put out by Sony of all companies. I mean, they're no Apple, but still, it's a tech company taking digs at tech companies. Now, what did unfortunately get through from the top brass was probably the second name change for the movie. Having gone from Control-Alt-Escape to Mitchell's vs. the Machines, many were surprised when the first promotional material had the movie being marketed as Connected. In fact, actually, I have quite a bit of anecdotal experience around the first promotional material, as it was one of the earliest animated movie trailers that I proper hopped on and discussed because I didn't see people discussing it enough. And back then, we had no idea of the actual messaging and heart that would make this final product. And so in a lot of ways, it was a really interesting 50-50, or at least that was my first impression at the time, as it was very clearly kind of having that boomer discussion of phones bad, technology bad, young kids are stupid. Or at least that was the vibe you got from the trailer, as it was talking about the main conflict with the family. And then, yeah, at the end of that movie, slap bang in big text and somewhere on some hashtags along the bottom was the word connected. A nice-ish pun for family relationships and technology, but to be honest, it was an awful title for the movie. Still, I hold a weird bubble of nostalgia for those uncertain times, and it's probably the most biggest, satisfying reveal I've seen from trailer to movie since I started this YouTube thing. But actually switching for a final time properly to Mitchell's vs. the Machines, and damn, that's a good title. I mean, when going forwards with such a generic single-word title like Connected has all the quirkiness and vibrance of the movie completely absent from it, you know? And I almost feel like if the movie had been released theatrically like that, the marketing would have completely derailed this movie. Set for a January 2020 release originally, this movie was then delayed to September 2020. However, for those eagle-eyed viewers out there, a whole thing happened between January and September that completely changed the world, and it wasn't a robot apocalypse. Indeed, COVID-19 and the grand procession of lockdowns that followed meant that movies in the cinema weren't a hugely viable thing anymore, and that is an interesting point for the direction of where this movie and its impact goes. Consequently, as the very first move, Sony passed on the rights to Netflix to release the movie. And side note, can we just appreciate that Sony's the only major studio to have played the streaming wars completely differently? Whilst every other major studio has struggled to varying degrees in trying to get their streaming services off the ground, they've just let them battle it out and instead sold the rights to stream their titles. Basically, they're making money off of all these guys desperate for content, and I think that's just quite funny. Of course, every studio comes with their pros and cons, grumbles and adorations, but at least on this front, it's a W for Sony. Anyway, Netflix agreed to change the title back to Mitchell's vs. Machines, and it was finally released in April of 2021. Suddenly a whole new look for a major studio animated movie, and within 28 days of release, it became Netflix's most widely viewed animated title and scored a solid 97% on Rotten Tomatoes. The movie was incredibly well received and even got nominated for Best Animated Feature, which I personally think it should have won. It's an outstanding success that was a major ripple for movies coming to streaming, as well as the new artistic direction first started by the Spider-Verse movies. But before we talk about the future precedent that it set, 3 years on now, why is this such a great movie in the present? Well, we've already gone over the animation style, not only riffing off the different places you could go with it, as introduced by Spider-Verse, but also going completely their own way with it. The character designs alone are a satisfying blend of that animation with Gravity Falls, which obviously makes a lot of sense. I'd even say there's a tiny bit of Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs about some of it, again going back to that Lord and Miller connection. However, it's the Mitchell family itself that is really what makes this movie special. Thank you very much for making it halfway through this video. This is the point where I plug in to tell you to subscribe if you haven't already to keep up with future anniversary episodes. There are 5 anniversaries of note for next month. And let me know if you've got any memories attached to this movie, or maybe it's inspired you with its creative and hearty messaging. I'd love to hear it in the comments or on our Discord server, but otherwise I'll let you get back to the anniversary of Sony's Mitchell's vs. the Machines. Katie Mitchell is a perfect Gen Z protagonist. Not only can this current generation empathize with her, but the people who made this movie made it clear that they can relate to her and her place in the world. Most creative people who struggle to feel understood relate to that, myself included. She touches on characters we've seen before and yet feels completely fresh and original still. Using wild animation beats as if she's drawn on the screen herself is also a great touch. It's as if Katie herself got the final edit on the movie, which I just absolutely adore. The animated doodles from her own movie are also pasted all over the actual movie, and much more effectively than those Diary of a Wimpy Kid kind of movies, may I add. Some find the 2010 memes beat a bit jarring, which I can totally understand. However, my counter-argument would be that it feels authentic to Katie's character. A talented but young girl who's about to be a film student would make these more adolescent editing choices. Even that kid going to college trope is something we haven't really seen in animation. The only real example I can think of is Toy Story 3, which I gotta mention a gripe here for. Toy Story 3 came out in 2010, right? I was 14. I couldn't relate to Andy. I was a little too young to be going away to college, so I was like, oh, I'm too young to be Andy in this, he's me moment. And Katie in this movie came out in 2021. I finished uni by then. My uni times was 2015 to 2018. There's only 2 animated going to college movies, and I missed both of them. I'm both too old and too young. Why couldn't I be represented at the time? Monsters University was about as close as I got, and that was 2013. Still too young. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. Despite the robot uprising thrown in there, the road trip premise set up at the start just continues with the added stakes, exploring with the same themes of the family dynamics. There's some criticism that the mum and son are not as prioritized as much as Dad and Katie, but that's because they're not the protagonists of the story. This is Rick and Katie's story as they try and rekindle their bond before she moves on to the next stage of her life and potentially never sees them again. It's a notable life event that for some parents means that they see their child far, far, far less than they would hope to, especially if they end on naff terms. No matter what crazy crap is happening around them, the movie holds on to the fact that this is the story they are telling. Once you hit the end credits as well, you see how personal this movie was to Mike Rianda. The combined transition from the Mitchells to his real family and the end card dedicating the movie to weirdos everywhere communicates the passion that was put into this project. Having the old family photos of the cast and crew was also a very classy touch that made the movie feel even more personal. And I think that's kind of one of the more astounding elements of this movie. There is clearly so much heart and soul and passion in there. And its affinity to being a little weird and a little bit strange and saying that that's okay and that's good is something that can resonate to so many people in their lives and the weird family dynamics that I'm sure are out there. And it's not necessarily that common. There are all sorts of movies you can see where an adventure takes place or there's some fun slapstick, but to have stories where characters are allowed to specifically be weird or imperfect and just be themselves is a great message for children that I find surprisingly doesn't pop up as often as it should. Not to mention you can extract other details like the fact that Katie is a part of the LGBT community. And though it's clearly not up front and center and part of the plotline, there's all sorts of evidence you can find throughout to prove it. And that as well is a whole new layer of representation that is great to see, especially 3 years ago when it was a lot less common, especially in animation. But okay, yeah, the movie's alright. What is the impact and the ripples it had going forwards into the future? How did it impact the industry now that we are 3 years beyond it? Well, on the one hand, at least for me, it really solidified Lord and Miller's reputation amongst me and seeing their repertoire of past productions. Only adding to the hype as they continued on to Spider-Verse 2, as much as that ended up being animation crunch territory. But still, I also think it made a major bump for Sony as an animation studio to be taken a little bit more seriously. Considering just a few more years back, Sony was known as the people who made the Emoji Movie, for them to turn around and make a masterpiece like this after the super success of Spider-Verse and not crumbling against their own weight, really shows that these guys could be the heavy hitters themselves. Plus, during the phase of 2021, Pixar was showing up with the likes of Soul that flopped financially. Warner Brothers was coming out with the very strange re-rendition of Scooby-Doo in Scoob. And Raya and the Last Dragon was the last thing that Disney had put out, which was a bit of a 50-50 on that front. The fact that they managed to squeak by in the midst of these streaming services, mostly unscathed and certainly not struggling as badly as the others, is a major win that they should really be proud of. Plus, they came to learn that releasing a movie straight to streaming via Netflix is a great way to get so many eyes on. To the point that all sorts of companies continued looking at the streaming service route to the point that we are now. And then going further in the future, we started seeing more copycat inspirations from the likes of the art style of Mitchells vs. Machines. In 2022, DreamWorks came out with The Bad Guys, which has that similar sort of flourish of Spider-Verse-ian effects with the extra 2D additions like Mitchells vs. Machines. And then very recently, last year in 2023, we had Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem, which is just so Mitchells vs. Machines coded, but just it's green. Of course, when it comes to the visual cherry picking, that's a lot easier of a thing to duplicate very quickly on, and we're only 3 years on from the first movie. So when exactly we'll start seeing more heart and more family dynamics and tech overlord uprisings coming through might take a little bit more time. Plus, you could argue that will come from more, reflections of the modern day when it comes to the AI uprising, rather than, hey, it's a Mitchells vs. Machines reference. But even still, I think this was a massive, massive success that really did solidify the flag that Spider-Verse brought up, and showed that it could be done in other styles, and could just show so much creative flourishing. Whenever a movie trailer releases showcasing both 3D and 2D animation intermixed in, I just instantly think of Mitchells vs. Machines, and I'm instantly far more hyped for a movie because of it. It dared to push the boundaries of what could be done visually as well as from a writing perspective, because movies with heart are rare to come by, and this is easily my most favorite movie of the decade. Probably in my top 20, to be honest. It is just stellarly done all the way through, except for the fact that the boy's voice is so low. Takes me out of it sometimes. Dare I say it's the best portrayal of a family relationship since The Incredibles, and tells a completely different story with that angle. It's not that if everybody's super, then nobody is. It's that anybody can be special, even if they are not super. After seeing Bob have a complete midlife crisis, it's great to see a father figure struggling with a different issue. Rick seems pretty self-assured with who he is and his worldviews, but that's what's making him struggle in his dynamic with Katie. Plus, this movie's ending to Act 2 has that surprisingly rare Pixar factor where that storyline leads towards you potentially actually crying. It's such a good emotive twist. Its legacy, I do think, has seen more effort being put into animated projects to up the game in its storytelling and the character's journey. I mean, after all, one of the biggest surprises of Puss in Boots 2, beyond the animation, was how strong the exploration of Puss in Boots' character was. It seems DreamWorks is keeping a close eye and certainly taking notes. Animated characters can be completely designed around their personality, and I think Mitchells vs. Machines has played its part in showing how interesting they can be when you give them that depth to explore across the movie. The personal touch, that's the movie's legacy. So 3 years on this fine April 22nd, I say happy birthday, Mitchells vs. Machines. You were for sure one of the greats. For now though, my name's been Daz. Thank you very much for reaching the very end of this gush. Do let me know your thoughts on the movie or any personal memories you may have from this movie or what it inspired. And on that note, I shall see you in a little bit.